All right. Well, thank you for making time in your afternoon. Come to the presentation. Hopefully, we'll have some conversation going forward. This is developing conservation plans for Long Island Sound marsh complexes in New York. And so, as I will show you, this is sort of halfway through a project. In which case we've done some work with some model results, and we've a data analysis as well. So we're presenting that as well as getting some feedback about the possible creation of conservation plans in the second part of the project. This is being recorded, this webinar. If you would like to speak up, please raise your hand and we will enable your microphone. And if you'd like to, there's a simple poll that you could just introduce yourself. Looks like we have a split between Nassau and Suffolk County folks for the on this call so far, and some federal government, some local government, some NGOs so far in terms of who's answered the poll, but we can look at that later. And right, introduce yourself in the chat would be a nice way to get a sense of who is joining us today. Right, so this project is a project with DEC, Long Island Sound Study, and NEIWPCC, funded by EPA. But because of that, I have to disclaim that they are not vouching for the model results or any trade names or commercial products. Same with NEIWPCC and lists. And as this webinar is being recorded, so that people who can't make it can look at it, watch it later. But I think there's a low probability of it going viral, so you don't have to worry if you want to share your microphone. Probably won't get widely disseminated. I'm Jonathan Clow with Warren Pinnacle Consulting. And I've been an environmental consultant since the mid-90s and working. Part of this is a modeling project. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about modeling the SLAM model, which I've been working with for probably too long. And the Vicki O'Neill is the person who probably catalyzed this project. She's with LIS and NEIWPCC. She's on leave, so I have to thank Samara Scantlebury for filling in, answering any questions if we have any questions that are DEC type of questions. Special thanks to Sarah Schaefer-Brown, it's a mouthful, with the LIS Sustainable and Resilient Communities Extension Professional, who's been helping me put together the presentation in this part of the project, and hopefully will be involved in terms of community outreach and creation of marsh conservation plans as we go forward. So in terms of the presentation, I'm going to start with a little bit of overview on what the project is, and we're going to introduce the model and the data analysis that's done. And also the web viewer, which shows the results of these, and there'll be a short hands-on training on that. So if you're interested in using the tool, give you a few minutes to get your hands on it, ask any questions you might have about that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about another project that linked into this project, where we worked on a quantification of ecosystem services that has some role in this current project. Then hopefully we'll get into a good conversation about conservation plans, what we might be able to get from them, from these local groups, and how the next steps of the project going forward. And again, if you have any, I'll stop for questions periodically, and if at any point you have any questions, feel free to write those questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand, and when we stop for questions, we will unmute you. So the primary purpose of this project, and this is really Vicky's brainchild, was to work on getting some marsh conservation plans within list municipalities, and getting these teams composed of local governments, state governments, and marsh conservation groups towards approaching coastal resilience. And this is actually the second part of this project. We went through this whole project one time, and we developed 2 conservation plans, which I will show you some examples of in just a moment. But what Vicky realized was that we have these model results for the entirety of coastal New York State, which were developed probably over about a decade through partnership with NYSERDA, funding from with NYSERDA. And those it kept taking time to update because data kept getting updated, and we added things like ecosystem services and uncertainty analysis and pieces like that onto the project. And so what Vicky had in mind was to basically, the results of these projects, while interesting and useful, were kind of lost as just data layers, GIS layers that most people don't have access to or don't have the time to download and incorporate into their projects. And so her thought was that we could focus on sort of specific marsh systems, named marsh systems, primary marsh systems in Long Island and New York portion of Long Island Sound, and develop a viewer that shows those model results, but also incorporate land ownership data, tax parcel data from the counties. And then also to, based on these model results, do a data analysis that looks on a tax parcel basis, how much marsh is there currently, how much marsh is there predicted to be under sea level rise, where are the locations where the marsh might migrate within those tax parcels, within those sort of larger piece. And that brings us to where we are right now, which is where a presentation of the viewer, what it looks like now, and the results of the data analysis. And then the next parts of the project are going to go fairly quickly. Development of marsh conservation plans. And so we're going to enter into 2 or 3 cooperative agreements with municipalities or other marsh conservation stakeholder groups, and work together to create documents over a 3 or 4 month period. And then we'll have community workshops where we roll out what these conservation plans are and get community feedback and incorporate those into the project. Many of you probably are aware of the benefits of coastal marshes and why we're here, and that's why you're here. But just to point out a few of them, just sort of as an introductory piece, they're well-known ecological powerhouses, you know, ranging, providing really important food web that goes all the way up to the charismatic bird species, birds of prey, and then game fish and fishing, all kind of driven by the marsh edge and the nekton habitat. But they also have other, so that might be considered a ecological benefit. There are a number of human-centered benefits as well. Wave attenuation is being more widely studied, and erosion control of shorelines, so protection of shorelines and protection against property damage. Nutrient sequestration, both in terms of blue carbon benefits, and also in terms of purification of neighboring waterways, nitrogen and phosphate in particular. And then, you know, sort of obviously, but also very important is recreation, kayaking, and just the character of place that marshes provide. So there are a couple of examples of marsh conservation plans from the previous project, which I should have emailed around previously, but I think Sarah is going to put these links into the chat. They're pretty simple links anyway. tinyurl.com Mattituck plan, and then the next one. So in the first phase, we did 2 of these, and just based, these are really a cooperative work with the groups that we're working with, and so for Mattituck, we went in looked at Mattatuck alone. And in working with Westchester County, the people who we were working with wanted to go more with breadth rather than depth. So we went as deep as we could, but it was more like a broad look at the various at 6 different sort of named marsh systems within Westchester County. So that just kind of gives you a sense of the flexibility that we have in putting these things together. And just getting back to the timeline again, here we are in early February, and we've got the Marsh Fate Viewer, which I'll present in a moment. Then we have about the end of February to choose which plans we're going to develop, and then sort of 3-month periods to develop conservation plans, and the community workshops in June. So the first time that we went through this, Vicki and I worked to identify what we consider to be the most significant marsh complexes in the Long Island Sound portion of New York State, and also to spread them across counties and to include Long Island Sound stewardship area marsh complexes, and the sort of major state and county parks that have unfragmented tidal wetland complexes. And but it ended up kind of being certainly the biggest marsh complexes got the most attention, and that was clear in Westchester County. You can see we only had selected 1, but Westchester County was very interested in, and there are 6 not insignificant marsh systems in Westchester County. So we went back to the drawing board and selected 47 more. And in this process, so that's a total of 67 sort of named marsh systems, which are shown in these shape files. And what we worked on was incorporating both the current marsh footprint and also the potential future marsh footprint in our consideration. So some of these areas may not have a lot of marsh now, but have the potential for marsh habitat in the future. Those are kind of the 2 maps that we looked at. The other point, though, is that these, and this is sort of the western part, the eastern part is stretched out. Fisher's Island is one example where there's not a lot of current marsh habitat, but there is potential for future marsh habitat based on the land elevations and what the model's telling us. But the other thought is that to point out that the model results are continuous for New York, coastal New York State. So any portion of the law, it doesn't have to be a named marsh in order to go forward as a marsh conservation plan. And in fact, in the first phase of the project for Westchester, we did 5 marsh systems that were not in the viewer. And I think that project came out pretty well. So you don't have to tune out if the place you're interested in is not included in the viewer. So the marshes in Long Island Sound face many threats. One of the ones that we really focus on here, just because we have the model results, is the impact of sea level rise. It's complicated, but something that can be modeled. And this is this sort of a simple diagram of what that looks like, how marshes actually migrate as a result of sea level rising. But it is important to acknowledge that there is some complexity in the modeling, because as you can see, the land changes under the marshes as the marsh collect organic and inorganic matter, settling, organic matter through the plant growth. And so this is a diagram of some of it turns out that the increase in marsh surface elevation can be a very complicated process. You've got plant growth, sediment trapping, you've got, it says elevation gain via subsurface expansion. You can also have elevation collapse under different, if salinity goes up, addition of organic carbon, below ground decay. So there's a lot going on there. And as you'll see, the way that we model this process is rather simple, but then we also try to put fairly wide uncertainty bounds around that to understand the impact of that uncertainty and the simplicity of that model. The other thing that we take into account in our modeling are barriers to marsh migration. For example, steep terrain will prevent marsh migration. And this is actually something in not everywhere, but in a lot of places in Long Island Sound, there is a fair degree of vertical relief. There's fairly steep lands, which is good news for the houses that are perched up above the water. In many cases, they're not going to be flooded by regular tides, but less good news for the marshes that are trying to find a habitat under sea level rise. The model also takes into account land development, vertical walls, and impervious surfaces. So that's kind of an overview of where we're going with that. I don't know if anybody has any questions at this point. You can chat or raise your hand. But there's no pressure on that, because I don't think there was not a lot of that's more of an overview piece to start, as opposed to getting into any of the details. All right, so the model that this is that the data analysis. So again, this is kind of a two-part presentation. The first is to present how we created this data analysis, how we created these model results for where marsh habitats might be. And the second part is what our marsh conservation plans look like in the past, and sort of what groups might be interested in producing marsh conservation plans in the future. But the model that we used is the sea level affecting marshes model. I think as an overview, it's very complicated, has a lot of land cover types because it's been being used for years and years. And so different clients had different interests in different types of habitats and breaking things down further. We simplify that in this case. But it does simulate the dominant processes in wetland conversions, but it does all of those fairly simply. However, we also try to take into account uncertainty in terms of that. And as I've said, it has a long and storied history. It was produced in the mid-1980s by my colleague, the late Dr. Richard A. Park, and Jim Titus at EPA. Was involved in the report to Congress, United Nations Environment Program report. But you can see the graphics were a little simple back in the day. The cell size, I think, was 500 meter cell size, and it's been being developed ever since. But similar to what we saw before, the SLAM model takes an equilibrium approach to where marsh habitat is going to reside. You're going to have the two primary marsh categories are high marsh, which the National Wetland Inventory calls an irregularly flooded marsh. And that marsh, according to National Wetland Inventory and the elevations that we have, there's a lot of high marsh in the Long Island Sound area, which is good news in some sense, because before it converts to open water, it's going to, if it falls in elevation, it's going to likely convert to a low marsh, Spartina alterniflora, for example, which is inundated daily. And then as you have sea level rise occur, granted this fact that these land elevations are also changing over time, but you can have a horizontal migration as opposed to that vertical sea level rise signal. So while this is a fairly simple model at its heart. Basically, what's the land elevation going to be, and what are the marsh types going to be? The other consideration here in terms of the modeling is the fact that it really is looking exclusively at sea level rise as the signal that is causing marshes to move or convert to open water. So if there are other factors such as too much nutrient contamination, erosion due to boat traffic, additional development or fill, that's not good. So this is really kind of these model results are really kind of a best case scenario. in terms of what sea level rise can do. But while it has a simple basis for its model, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this, but it does simulate this this relationship between marsh elevation. It simulates uncertainty. It takes into account dikes and levees, to the ability to the extent that we have those data, where infrastructure is, how frequently that's going to be flooded. Hydraulic connectivity is taken into account. Salinity is to the extent that we have those data, and then the uncertainty analysis, where you try to take the uncertainty of all these model parameters and look at them simultaneously. So with that, I'm going to, that's the sort of the basic model that underlies. We had these model results that were, as I said, developed probably over most of a decade and published on a couple of times. We have the Marsh Interactive Fate Viewer, and Sarah just put the link into the chat. So as I said before, there are 26 SLAM land cover types, and you know, a lot of these are not really relevant: cypress swamp or flooded cypress swamp, mangrove. It just is because of the breadth of how this model's been applied. And so with the help of Ducks Unlimited, several years ago, we produced a simpler mapping of land cover types that that are useful for a majority of stakeholders. And the way we define these, and we'll be looking at some of these maps going forward, is we have a low tidal, which is this gray color, and that is will be non-vegetated tidal flats or beaches. It turns out National Wetland Inventory doesn't necessarily discern between tidal flats and beaches anyway, so it's kind of convenient to collapse them, because honestly, a lot of times we don't really know unless we have some boots in the ground knowledge about what the substrate is there, whether we're talking about something that's more extensively organic matter or more extensively beaches. And the SLAM model actually tries to figure out what it might be based on its proximity to open water and its proximity to ocean water, tries to make an educated guess in terms of whether it's a sand substrate or not. But anyway, those are collapsed. And the other important thing to note is that these are not marsh. And usually this is a function of their elevation. When marshlands go, their elevation is below mean tide level. Usually that's about the point where they cease to become marshes and start to become tidal flats or beaches that are exposed only at low tide. So the maps that we look at are low tide maps, the predictions at low tide. So this, you know, these areas would be covered with water and other times. Then we have the low marsh, the regularly flooded, usually a salt marsh, often Spartina alterniflora. The high marsh category consists both of, it's basically an elevation range which would support a high marsh, but could also support like a scrub shrub type of category, or may just be in the process of transitioning to marsh. So it's kind of in terms of the NWI data, it starts out where there's actual vegetation there. In terms of the model predictions, it's sort of a potential high marsh category. Then we also look at some of the freshwater categories, the dark green category here being freshwater non-tidal, so just an inland fresh marsh, not subject to salinity. In this case, it's just perched up in terms of elevation, so it doesn't have any, seems really close to the salt water, but it does not actually impacted by the salt water in this case. And then tidal fresh marshes is much more rarely shown. The other category, which we break down when we look at these, is flooded developed lands. And these are based on percent impervious data. So it can be either a building or a road, a parking lot, or something along the lines of that, which can be interesting information in terms of thinking about whether a parcel would be easy to make way for sort of future marsh habitat or not. The other thing that I want to talk about in terms of the background here are the sea level rise scenarios that we looked at. So the modeling, the last round of modeling that we did for NYSERDA was in 2017. So we do use the 2016 New York Governor's Office sea level rise scenarios. And the three that we're focusing on we modeled 5. But the three we're focusing on are low, medium, and high, which range from about 4 meters between roughly 2,000 and 2,100. I'm sorry, 0.4 meters to just under 1 meter. The meters are over here, to almost 2 meters. So when we look at those scenarios, and we did also look at that more recently. We've looked at the 2022 NOAA scenarios, updated mean projections along US coastlines. And the interesting thing about those projections is that in the year 2100, the range is still very similar, ranging from a low of something around 0.4 to a high of about 2 meters. But a lot of that sea level rise occurs in the second half, so the curve is a little bit steeper. So I would say ultimately these are mostly consistent with the latest projections, but the latest projections might have a lot of the sea level rise occurring in the back end, meaning you'd have more resilience even in a high scenario through 2050, and then all of a sudden big trouble in the second half of the century. And then in terms of the sea level rise uncertainty, there was a New York City panel on climate change, which looked at this uncertainty particularly, and we developed a distribution, a triangular distribution with most likely value being approximately, I think it's 1.04 meters. And so when we run an uncertainty analysis, we're going to run the model hundreds of times, and we're going to sample from this distribution. And so we're going to have a lot of samples right here in the middle. We're going to have smaller number of samples. And so the way that we hit these was to fit the 5th percentile, the 95th percentile, as reported here, to that distribution. So another piece of the viewer, so that's basically those are how the model results were developed for the viewer. Another piece of the viewer is that for each of the 67 named marshes, you can link to fact sheets. They're 2 pages for the most part, 2 pages each. There's 2 pages of background on each one that doesn't change from one site to the next. But these provide an overview of a site in terms of what it has currently for marsh habitat and what it's predicted to have in the future, along with some maps. So the graphics in the fact sheets are very similar to the graphics that you'll see in the viewer. It's just you can't go quite in, you can't go to the tax parcel basis on the fact sheets, but it shows, for example, the current marsh. So here we have high marsh. This is what we see a lot in terms of the NWI designation, and it's backed up by the elevations that we see of these wetlands from the elevation data that we have, the relationship between elevation and tides, that these are irregularly flooded marshes, which we call high marshes, in the blue color. And then we have this gray color, which is a non-tidal portion. You can see here on the satellite a little bit of the marsh to open water interface. But on on this map on the lower, this is the probability of marsh habitat in the year of new marsh habitat in the year 2100. So this is excluding areas that currently have marshes. Where could marsh potentially expand in this site? And this color, I'm just going to spend a moment on this because we're going to look at a number of these probability maps. This is the probability of a marsh habitat. And the reason it's a probability is because we're running hundreds of sea level rise scenarios. We're running hundreds of accretion scenarios. We are varying the elevation data based on its uncertainty hundreds of times, erosion data hundreds of times. And so the dark color in this case actually means it's a higher probability of being an area that would have marsh habitat. So these areas here, even under they're pretty it looks like under 80 to 90% of the sea level rise scenarios that we hit this area with by 2100, these areas would potentially be marsh habitat. On the other hand, these blue fringy areas would really only be under the highest scenarios, getting up around 2 meters. So it shows sort of the, and 2 meters has been considered kind of a plausible upper end of sea level rise for some time, just due to the capability of the ice sheets to melt. But I haven't revisited that in the last few years, so I don't know if there's any new data on that or not. And the other thing the fact sheets have are these tables, which we also have these tables for every one of the tax parcels that that are in these sites that have potential marsh in them in the future. And so what the tables look at are going from top to bottom. They have the existing marsh. So when this is existing marsh, this means as of the beginning of the simulation. So marsh that is currently existing. So it tracks that over time. And you can see there's 60 acres of that on public land, 13 on private. And actually by 2055, because those are high marshes, they're all considered to still be very likely to still be marsh. Probably in some cases they will convert to low marsh. So again, this is sort of your best case scenario, looking at sea level rise only. And then by 2100, you do start to see some losses of marshes in these areas. Then you can look at the new marsh areas, which is what we were looking at in this graph here, areas which would have new marsh. And it's interesting because in the current situation, you have most of the marsh is on public land. In terms of the potential new marsh, it's the other way around. Most of the marsh migration areas are on private land. And you can also look at that's undeveloped, and developed is below that. And then finally you have the total potential marsh area. So, you know, if you look at this number at the bottom here, it seems like very positive because the number is going up. And probably the model suggests that results for this area aren't actually too bad because these high marshes have what's called elevation capital. They're sort of raised up fairly high above sea level right now. And it's going to take a lot of time for them to drop down below mean tide level. And so that's why they go down. But at the same time, you do have this potential for expansion. Now, the reason to be less optimistic is the fact that in a lot of New York State marshes, the tide trends, even without these significant sea level rise signals, the wetland trends are going the other way. We are losing marshes. So it's not exclusively a sea level rise thing. I mean, this model would suggest it's not the historic sea level rise that's been causing those marsh losses, but other factors, development, water quality, too many nutrients, moat erosion, whatever the case may be. So that's sort of like what the data analysis look like in the viewer. And I think going forward, yes, I want to just do a quick tour of what the how the viewer works, and then we're going to answer do a few hands-on exercise. I'll also answer any questions or anybody has first. All right, so let me bring up the viewer. So yeah, so the viewer is very similar to what we had from phase one. It's when you bring up the viewer, the first thing, you know, you just click out of the disclaimer. So we've tested it. If anybody's working with this and they have any issues, we have tested it across 5 different browsers. So hopefully it's pretty stable. But you start out by just showing all the marsh areas in the whole study area. If you hover over individual marshes, it'll give you sort of a name of what they are. And you can select which sites to show by county if you'd like. The entire study area is what's selected by default. If we want to go to Nassau County sites, you click on that and it'll bring you specifically to those sites. Get a better sense of what you're looking at. If you click not on one of the sites and you move it, you'll pan. You can also zoom in or out with the mouse wheel. or using the plus or the minus. And our hope is that these are fairly, this works pretty quickly. As I said, it's a lightweight, because we're not necessarily showing a layer that is continuous. It should make these things a little bit more rapid. So for example, if you click on one of the sites, let's say Center Island, it'll zoom you into that site. Now, based on how close you zoom in, you're going to start to get marsh results showing. So you, some cases in really big sites, like I think if I clicked on Mills Neck Creek, I have to actually zoom in a little bit further in order to get those to render. The other thing to note is that it's going to show one marsh system at a time. That's kind of how it was designed. It helps keep it lightweight. But if you're like in this section here and you're like, why am I not seeing Mills Neck Creek? Because you just have to move over a little bit. You have to make sure you're in the right spot so that you're not, so it doesn't get confused and think you're really looking at Center Island. When you bring up a marsh system, it starts out with a probability map in the year 2100. And it also shows you a legend over here to the left, which shows you the probability. And hopefully it's pretty straightforward. There is a link to the fact sheet here. So if you click on that, it'll bring up your the fact sheet that I discussed earlier and give an overview for the site. So as I said, the default is for a probability map to come up. So you have an option here in the upper right to either look at a probability map, a marsh type map, or to have no overlay. So I'm just going to start a little bit here with the no overlay, just to look at the tax boundaries. You know what? I just fixed this today, but this is supposed to say anyway, this Nassau County data. It's just a misattribution right here. But it basically gives you information that the blue tax boundaries are public and the black tax boundaries are private land. And these are all the lands. If you go to the probability map and I bring this, these are all the lands that have the potential, any potential to have future marsh habitat. So even like a little fringe of possible marsh habitat by the year 2100 would be included in these parcels. And sometimes it's a little hard to see the colors. So let me go back to no overlay, which is public and which is private. So you can change the base map here in the upper right. You can go right to satellite imagery, which can be useful to look at and interesting and give you a good sense of what's going on from Esri. The black and white map is useful because then you can really see what's public and private in terms of the blue shading. You can see that this area here is owned. If you click on it, you get information about the parcel, the owner. It's public. It's owned by the Incorporated Village of Center Island. And you can see that it has so interesting. If I go back to the marsh type here and I bring, I'm going a little faster, but I'm gonna just bring the date down to the year 2004. So this is kind of what the current NWI coverage shows us. It shows us that at this location, this area, which is really the predominant area with marsh, is publicly owned. But there is a fair amount of marsh lands that are privately owned at this site. So now you've got these pieces put together, and you have I'm going to go ahead and turn off the tax boundaries for just a moment. So if you are looking at, these are the marsh maps that we were looking at before. So again, a lot of high marsh, a lot of marsh with a fair amount of elevation capital. And if you look at the low sea level rise, which is 38 centimeters by 2100, so that's actually not that much higher sea level rise than we've seen over the past 50 years. So really a low estimate. And if you recall from the PowerPoint presentation, it has a pretty low probability of being that low. But if you look at that low sea level rise scenario, you can then move this date slider and kind of push through and see what are predicted, what the predicted changes are. You can get a little bit of a animation of what's happening through the year 2100. And in this case, there's not a lot of marsh loss. There are some areas which are predicted to become lower marsh. If you look at the medium sea, let me go back to the current condition, look at the medium sea level rise scenario. This is, I think, closer to the most likely sea level rise scenario as many scientists. Truth is, there's a lot of uncertainty about sea level rise, but a lot of people would put the most likely somewhere just slightly above 1 meter. This is slightly below 1 meter. And you can see there's a lot more conversion. Again, there's not a lot of marsh loss. There's more conversion to low marsh. The other thing is, in a lot of this area in Center Island, there's not a tremendous amount of marsh expansion. So you've got kind of the good news and bad news. The good news is not a lot of marsh loss. The bad news is not a lot of possibility for future marsh expansion. If you look at the high sea level rise, now you are looking at marsh loss in the current condition. The other thing to point out is that this model is basically assuming that you can move from a high marsh to a low marsh without losing habitat. And so that's a major change. If you have a high marsh, it suddenly becomes regularly flooded. There can be some major changes in the soil chemistry as a result of that, in the salinity. So you're looking at a major, even if you're not necessarily looking at marsh loss per se, you are looking at a major ecological change that's predicted. And then this area here seems, especially to the southeast, seems especially vulnerable to dryland flooding and the like. So now that we've looked at those maps and we have a sense of what's predicted for the site as a whole, you can look at the probability maps. So the probability map is going to just say whether there's a likelihood that there could be a marsh habitat there, and it actually doesn't take into account developed versus undeveloped. So even if a marsh is going to be over a road or a parking lot or somebody's house, it's just going to say, well, that's potential marsh habitat. And so what you can see is that these areas, so the current condition has a very low, has basically maps what the NWI looks like, the probability, the NWI. It looks like there's some uncertainty here just because we are varying the tide range in 2004 to its widest. So this uncertainty is probably a little bit of an exaggeration in terms of what was there. But you can see that the current marsh, the area that's red to begin with, it doesn't usually turn, some of it starts to turn a little bit purple. So maybe there's, under the worst case scenario in 2100, maybe like there's a 30% chance, given what we know about sea level rise, that those marshes are going to be lost, but they have a lot of elevation capital. And then you see that areas down here are pretty highly likely to be flooded by 2100. So based on what, the uncertainty that we had from that 2013 climate report, that there may be like a 70% chance of there being regular flooding there, to the point where that there could be an existing marsh. So let's see, I think that covers that. I've talked about changing the background, which can be useful. Looking at the 3 different types of marshes: marsh type, probability, or no overlay. We looked at the fact sheets. There is the other thing, a couple of things to point out is that there is a link to the modeling project website, which so this is right. So we call it the NYSERDA 2015 project, although it wasn't published until 2018, the work. But this is basically, if you want all of the data, which there's a lot more here as well. We have some modeling of adaptation strategies. We have, so if you really are a GIS or want some more information, there's road inundation results, more sea level rise scenarios. There's a lot here. So if you want to go back to the original and find out exactly how the modeling was done, there's a lot of resources there. Also a help file. So if you get lost at all, this should lead you through, what the different pieces mean on the viewer. So unless there are any questions, I think I'm going to jump into the just the hands-on portion where you can spend 5 minutes, 6 minutes. It's not a very extensive sort of list of things to do. Just make sure you can drive the viewer and ask any questions if you have any. Go back to the slideshow here. So the questions that I ask are about the Frost Creek site. Thank you, Sarah, for posting the hands-on exercise link. Anybody who registered late can go to the that link and get a copy of that. If you have two screens, or if you have a second device, you can navigate to that, and then you can answer these questions, which look very big in the screen right now. We can answer these questions for a minute and see how easy it is to characterize these, and then we'll have a question answer discussion session in just about 5 minutes. Well, I think we'll get back into it. All right, so let's see, getting back to so did anybody have any questions about the exercise, or have any difficulty with it, or have the software not work? Definitely let us know via chat or via email if it's something more complicated. Hope you had a chance to go through this. So I'm just going to go through the exercise really quickly here. So I'm going to jump to Nassau County sites. Click on Frost Creek, sense of the site. It's interesting how the really dark green, they got a really nice satellite image of this, but it's not necessarily helping me right now understand the model results. So I'm going to go to black and white for a minute here. So the question was, what happens under low, like by 20? So first of all, we can go back to where we currently have marsh. Go ahead, and I'm going to turn off the tax boundaries for a moment here. So this is the current marsh footprint again, as is classic through, as common through a lot of these marshes, a lot of high marsh. If we look at under the low scenario, we have an expansion here, sort of in the central of the simulation. Under medium, actually, that expansion jumps from. So we have this area here that was originally dry land becoming all the way, so it's pretty low elevation because it's jumping all the way down to regularly flooded marsh, down to low marsh. And then under high sea level rise, it's actually lost. So you have dry land to open water conversion there predicted in the middle. In fact, there's a fair amount of marsh loss, what is left under high sea level rise is all generally low marsh for this location. So that's what I would say. If anybody would like to speak up or answer some of these questions, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll run through them. I am going to ask your favor of your help when we are having a conversation about marsh conservation plans coming up, because that section of the webinar really won't work unless we have some feedback and some conversation from the participants. But I'll let you off the hook for right now. So you get a sense of what's going on in terms of the low, medium, and high marsh. And now look at that in terms of the probability. I'm sorry, low, medium, and high sea level rise scenarios. It's interesting. So this area, the question is, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the probability approach? And I would say one of the weaknesses of the probability approach is the fact that it basically is just a marsh. And so the fact that this area here under high sea level rise is still a marsh doesn't really show up in the probability. It's actually changed from a high marsh to a low marsh, and it's probably just a barely clinging on low marsh, but it looks pretty robust in the probability, which, for what it is worth, there's a pretty low probability that you're actually going to have that marsh loss. And so there's a chance that there's still going to be some marsh there as well. The other weakness of it is that if you look at the marsh type map, now it turns out there's not a lot of development, not a lot of impervious land that is being overrun. There are some roads, If you look at the probability approach, you don't get any sense of that. It's just kind of here's where the marsh habitat could be. If you look at the marsh type map, you also get a sense of, okay, there are also going to be some significant obstacles to marsh expansion in these locations due to roads, maybe buildings. And then the other question is the land with current and future marshes, is it primarily public or is it primarily private? If we go to the current marsh footprint, I jumped off of that for a minute. The public to private, the blue and the black sometimes doesn't pop very well. In this area over here, it's partially also because you have a public and private interfaces are right next to one another. But this land here is these are all public lands. You can click on them, owned by the United States of America, Village of Ludington. Now, again, these data come from tax parcel data. There are some errors in them. So if you're looking at a site that you're working at, we actually, during this process, based on, we made some corrections to public versus private. And in some cases, we had to basically assign public versus private based on United States of America, that's clearly a public, the owner is US of A, that's clearly a public person. So based on just reading the names of the owners, which had towns in them. So this area over here is predominantly public. This area over here, it's interesting because a lot of little lots, a lot of the ones that have the marsh on them are public, but there are some private lands. And then when you look at the at the future marsh footprint, and let's go to probability map here, there's quite a bit of expansion onto some areas that are private. This area here in particular, which we pointed out, which becomes marsh and under high scenario actually goes back to open water again, is privately owned. So that's one of the probably one of the major areas of expansion in the site is this privately owned site. And then also adjoining some of these public owned land, there are some privately owned lots as well. And then if you click through to the fact sheet, which is actually the one that I had looked at before, you can sort of see what I was just talking about in this graphic here, in the fact that of the current 73 acres of marsh, they're predominantly public. But in terms of the future marsh, the new marsh in undeveloped areas, it's predominantly private. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts that they want to say about whether conservation implications or management implications based on these results. Are there any thoughts come up in particular? My thoughts about it are that a couple of things. First of all, the existing marsh resources, while they have a lot of elevation capital, will need to be monitored carefully for degradation under sort of increased salinity, that conversion from a high marsh to a low marsh, if and when that occurs, making sure that that's occurring in such a manner. There may have to be some marsh restoration or some marsh surface, just making sure that there's not a huge erosional event that accompanies that. And then, just thinking about the parcels that you may want to set aside for future, whether there are potential for easements or other activities that might occur on some of these private lands. Okay, let's see if I can get back my notes. That didn't work. Okay, so one more little technical section before we get into the section on, I have way too many windows open. I'm sure that happens to you as well. One more little technical section before we get into a discussion of, you know, and maybe an interest, sort of a brainstorm on marsh conservation plans and how we can leverage this work going forward. I want to just talk really briefly about model calibration. I want to talk about one of the major conclusions that we had when we looked at the uncertainty analysis for the model. And I also want to talk about something that we haven't talked about too much, which was part of this project where we tried to put a number on ecosystem services. So the model calibration is one piece that gives us some confidence that our model is working properly. So they have this conceptual model, again, that it's pretty simple, but that when you get below mean tide level, you have an unvegetated location. When you're above mean tide level, but below mean high or high water. Being flooded daily, you have a low marsh. Up to what we call a salt elevation. So the model suggests that if you're going to have regularly flooding every 30 days, that's really your boundary between your high marsh and your adjacent zone, which could be dry land. It could be freshwater wetlands. It could be freshwater swamps. And so we test that sort of with the current, we have all those data for the current conditions, current elevation data, current national wetland inventory data, current tide range data. And so we look at that and we make sure that the conceptual model works for the site. And that makes us feel confident that under future conditions, it will come to the same equilibrium. And there are many cases where we find places where the model's predicting too much flooding or not enough flooding. And in almost every case, we can figure out why that's the case. In some cases, we don't have a whole lot of tide range data. There are huge gaps. In some cases, we have a secondary wetland data set that will help us override the National Wetland Inventory, which could be out of date, or just the photo interpretation is fairly broad as it's a nationwide project. They don't include things like little creeks, smaller areas. And in many cases, the model shows us where there are actually seawalls or dikes that are preventing water from getting into a place. So that's just one aside about how the modeling is done. And just a quick overview. Some of the SLAM model strengths include its simplicity, the fact that it's an open source model. It was designed by policymakers, so it provides the information needed by policymakers. It's not sort of answering a question that is a scientific obscure question that doesn't have any feedback onto policy. And it contains the major processes pertinent to wetland fate, but some of them are done simply. And so just pointing out the fact that a lot of the more complicated models these days are hydrodynamic models. They're predicting, minute by minute, small cell by small cell water flows, as a function of, there's shear stress and topography and tide ranges and forcing from oceanic models. And they're very complex, but so it does not have any of that, or nor does it sort of have a mass balance of solids. It's not in some locations, if you have a major cliff, a bluff erosion or something like that occurring, you don't have a huge amount of sediment suddenly available to the marshes or the flats. Right, it's a sort of simple accretion model. It's not mechanistic. So it has a lot of simplicity to it. However, as that simplicity, if we can get the bounds of uncertainty that are caused by that simplicity, we can then assess that. The other point is that these mechanistic models often need a lot of calibration as well, and have they have their own share of uncertainty. And also just a reminder that when you have a marsh, so this graph here, I don't think I've explained it before, but when you get, this is sort of mean tide range, and this is an elevation above mean tide level. When you get a marsh that's perched up here, it's not getting flooded very regularly. And so your accretion rate, which is on the y-axis, is down pretty low. As sea level rise occurs, you can actually have the vertical movement of the marsh can actually start to increase until to a certain point that increases the resilience. But that is an uncertain relationship, and we just kind of model that empirically as opposed to modeling specifically where the sediment is settling and the like. And so this is an example of where we have set data points. The good news is the set data points for New York State do sort of match that conceptual model. The marshes that are up high to the right here do have somewhat lower, although not zero vertical movement rates, and the marshes that are down low are higher to a point until they get down to mean tide level, in which case they start going back down again. And so we actually applied one of the mechanistic models as part of these projects, just to see, if it matched our curve, and we based our curve on that. But we also, again, this red lines here, so this reflects our conceptual model when you look at the data with 2 standard errors on every data point. It's a pretty wide range of uncertainty. And we kind of do that kind of analysis for every piece of data that we have, whether it is, we talked a little bit about the uncertainty due to sea level rise, uncertainty due to tide ranges, because, sometimes the data aren't as continuous as you would like, marsh erosion rates, and you end up with a result that is also a distribution. So it counts for basically every parameter in the model that's uncertain. We can replace with a distribution, sample that, and run the model hundreds of times. The reason I'm bringing this up again, not only because the simulation is showing probability results, but also because our finding that we published in 2016 was that all these uncertainties in the model that people spend a lot of time about, uncertainties of accretion, elevation, all of these are very small compared to uncertainties in sea level rise. So for example, here are New York City coastal marsh hectares. And you can see, because the model is assuming that marsh is going to successfully migrate into everybody's backyard and no one's going to build any vertical walls, you can see that the overall trend is upward under sea level rise. There's a lot more habitat that is capable of being there. And the uncertainty due to the sea level rise and everything else is these wide bounds. So you can see it gets more and more uncertain going forward. But if we take a single sea level rise scenario, 1.04 meters, which is represented by this gray curve right in the middle of the high and the low sea level rise scenario, and you vary all the other parameters, excluding sea level rise, you get a much more narrow uncertainty band. And so the take-home message here is that I don't know, it doesn't necessarily matter whether your model is simple or complex. I don't think it's really the sea level rise is the driver, and that's the primary uncertainty, at least according to my interpretation of those results. And the last technical detail that I want to talk about in terms of this data analysis was ecosystem services. Now, if you go back to the viewer, if I go back to the viewer, and you can look at some of these sites, and as I said before, you click on a site, it gives you the owner information and the tax ID, and it gives you a sense of what's happening with the marshes. These are expected value results, which means these are all of the uncertainty results sort of added together. So the most, and you also have something called the Marsh Ecosystem Service value, which doesn't really have a unit associated with it. It's just a relative value. And what it is giving you is a sense of how many ecosystem services are being provided by that site over through the end of the century. So if you could have one site that has a lot of marsh that are expected currently, but they're expected to disappear, that you could have another site that has not a lot of marsh, but is expected to have a lot of marsh at the end, and they could have similar or even or different values. And so this is kind of just a really simple way of comparing sites and how much marsh they're going to have. Like if you were going to do an action, if you're going to choose an easement on 2 different sites, you could potentially look at them and say, okay, this is taking into account a lot of factors to say that this site has a higher potential for ecosystem values than this site does. And it's just on a scale of 0 to 100. If we added all the big sites that have 100, I mean, it's a little more obvious that they have high value for ecosystem services, and it makes the other value numbers extremely tiny. So we basically capped it at 100. So how do we come up to those? What's this concept of ecosystem services? And on our last project with NYSERDA, realizing that all marsh is not valued equally by either ecologically or for human-centered benefits. And so, for example, if you're looking at the benefit of wave attenuation, that obviously depends on the marsh location. If it's not protecting any infrastructure, the value of wave attenuation becomes lower. It also depends on the width of the marsh. The wider the marsh, the more value that it provides. And nutrient sequestration depends on the marsh type, high marsh versus low marsh. There are literature papers that discuss this, and the density and the location. Even something like recreation depends on whether there's already access and amenities there. So how do we put a relative value on these? It's a bit of an economic model, where we surveyed stakeholders to get a sense of what their values were, in terms of what they valued the most. And we had results from our uncertainty analysis, and we fed those through utility functions, which were a function of what the marsh looked like. It could be the width of the marsh, it could be how many marsh to open water interface there is, in order to get these ecosystem values for each site, and then integrate that over the period that the model was run for, so through the end of the century. And our work with stakeholders, first of all, we work with them to get the ecosystem services list that they're interested in, and then also work with them in literature to understand the relationship between the ecosystem services and the appropriate geometric metric. For example, nekton habitat, the literature suggests it is much more a function of the marsh to open water surface as being a function of total marsh. And so that was how we linked those together. Then we also polled stakeholders in terms of which of the services they valued the most, and then looked at site-specific strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, if you're looking at natural services, natural areas for underserved communities, we can use various indexes of local income and the like to specify that, or what areas have recreation or what areas have fishing locations. So all this analysis was sort of brought into this current project and then boiled down into that single number. So, take it for what it's worth. It can be an interesting examination of how this one sort of very large economic model boils down into it's essentially like a black box kind of concept, boils down to a single number, but it also generally gives you a good sense of what the overall, maybe one of the most powerful things about it that it does is that it integrates the data over time and uncertainty. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about marsh conservation plans, and then what I really want is for the attendees to spend a little bit of time thinking about a few questions which we'll ask, but is there interest in leveraging these results and additional work in creating a marsh conservation plan? What are the strengths? What are the best features of a marsh conservation plan? How can a marsh conservation plan get the most traction? And if you're not interested, also be very interested in why that's the case as well, just because that would help us in terms of understanding going forward. So building on the kind of materials that we created in the first phase of the project, which you might have had a chance to look at those plans. And the support that this project is offering, over the next 3 to 4 months, is some sort of central group communication once we've figured out who is in the stakeholder group, meeting support, organizing when the meetings are going to occur. We have existing document frameworks, which are very flexible. We can work with those, but it's a start. We can obviously have information about one of the most significant threats to marshes, which is sea level rise. So we can bring in those. And then what we did previously was we got a lot of materials from the team about history, about case studies, different language, and those are all integrated into a sort of a single cohesive result. And the other pieces that can be brought to bear if they're relevant are additional model results. As I said, the model results are continuous and a little bit beyond what is in the viewer even. So if there was interest in going beyond that, we could do that. And we did it previously. And if there are any areas of where literature, some additional literature analysis and summary would help, that's another piece in there. And in the previous projects that we put together, it's a fairly straightforward ABCD document outline. Start by defining what the marsh resources are. Talk about the benefits, talk about the threats, and then work on the marsh conservation planning. So sort of a definition, the plus side, the dangers, and the planning. In terms of the marsh resources, the historical status of whether they're gaining or losing or staying level, and the history of marshes in the location and how different fill has occurred and things like that. How many marshes there were historically, I think was really interesting and helpful, just because to a certain extent sometimes it helps provide context for what has been done to them in the past. The benefits that are provided by marshes, we had leaned quite a bit on the work that we did for ecosystem services that I was just discussing. We also, but also brought site-specific case studies, site-specific pictures, recreation locations, things like that, to bear, and also brought in site-specific information about ecology and the like. And along with sea level rise, some of the other major threats that we looked at were development, water quality, and marine debris. So we can develop those with local case studies as well. And finally, the options for marsh conservation planning. I'm hoping that that's one area which we can continue to expand. Hopefully there's a lot of room for creativity there in terms of this portion of it. Just some examples from the Mattatuck Creek report showing how the channel had been moved using some historical highway map books, using some historical photography to show how an area that was wet and wetlands was completely filled in to become housing. Looking at some of the marsh loss trends analysis that exist for across New York State to get a sense, for Mattatuck Creek, actually they're fortunate that from 1974 to 2008 or so, there was really no marsh loss, which is not the case for a lot of the other marshes. Looking at public versus private land ownership and pointing out privately owned marshlands in particular. Looking at specific habitat resources, the osprey nesting sites along Mattatuck Creek. And then when we got to marsh conservation, looked at a number of different possible tools. land purchases and easements, marsh restoration, and here's a case where you have a vertical seawall that's being replaced with a nature-based shoreline design. And then the data gathering and analysis and education, some of that is actually the marsh conservation plan in itself. I think one of its roles can be education and data gathering analysis, but also pointing out different gaps where there could be additional data that are gathered. And the other thing to focus on a little bit is in terms of marsh restoration. Just wanted to point out the fact that the Long Island Sound Study Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan, there's a committing to restoring an additional 515 acres of tidal wetlands. So that's an area where LIS is looking for projects, and so it's possible a marsh conservation plan can help get those projects in a local area. And I highlight these areas down here because I feel like designate, like one of the we have a lot to build on that we didn't have previously in terms of the document framework. That doesn't mean we have to go in those directions, but those could be done fairly quickly. And my hope is, what I really would like to hear from people about in terms of when we're discussing this, is what can we do to make these documents not just something that sits in someone's library or that someone sees, but actually make them working documents that where you can actually make some decisions about designating areas to focus on. And that can be, I think, that can be risky because there are obviously political risks. And you have different, if you have a multi, you have a lot of different groups that might have different ideas. So just having this model be something that, I'm sorry, this document be something that spurs more work, outreach. It actually provides information. And I believe the other reports have, they are, I just feel like there could be some additional work in this. I'm not, exactly tuned in terms of following up on the other reports. And I think there is progress being made in those locations, but. So again, the time frame, if you have interest in, if you can think of like a natural project in this area where this could be helpful for, and you could come up with a group of stakeholders. We're hoping to complete that process by the end of this month to figure out which groups. And as I said before, we're flexible in terms of the number that we're doing. So send us a proposal or your thoughts, or tell them now in the chat, or we can raise your hand and speak up. We'd love to hear from you. Then there's a 3-month period where we go through 3 parts. The first part is sort of deciding the document framework. The second part is displaying the partially completed draft and figuring out a pathway to get the holes filled in, and then a final draft for review, and then to have a community outreach meeting. So I would love to, if anybody would like to speak, I would love to, if you raise your hand, I'd be happy to, would be happy to make your microphone go. Are there any sites in particular that seem interesting or promising? I'd like to hear both positive feedback about what a marsh conservation plan might do. I'm also interested in, are there barriers to having this, just go beyond something that's just a report? Like what, be great to hear from people about their thoughts for Nassau County or any other location. Okay, let's see. Well, all right. So Heather, I think, yeah, there you go.
Hi.
Hi.
Not necessarily crazy about talking because I'm not as knowledgeable as I'd like to be, but I'm going to just dive in anyway. So Friends of the Bay, we're in, Oyster Bay, Cold Spring Harbor, Mill Neck Creek oriented, and we definitely would be interested in collaborating on marsh conservation planning. And I did go on this like a week ago onto the viewer just because I think it's really just very interesting, and you can definitely go down a rabbit hole when you start looking into it. But I think that, as I mentioned it in the chat, I have a staff of 1.5, but we do have a conservation committee who are, very, very engaged. And, I want to bring this to them, but, I don't have the background to know which sites are especially interesting and promising. And there might be 1 or 2 of my members who are, but I'm hoping that I can get some sort of help on focusing on a site that would be, that would have the most potential to be successful.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate. I'm really glad I didn't have to listen to my own voice for a few minutes for one thing, but also no, I appreciate that. That's great. And so if they have more interest, also we are going to make these. I'll be sending you a link to this presentation so they can zoom through the parts that they're most interested in if they have some if they want to. Or you can. There are going to be 2 of these workshops next week as well they could register for, but no, I appreciate that, and we'll be really interested after you have a chance to talk to them. I hope you can reach out and let us know what you find. And
yeah, I mean, I think that it would help. Okay, I can see that Chuck Idle is writing something, but I think it would help. I mean, I will send it to them. Again, we have like maybe 1 or 2 people on the whole committee who might have a little bit of a background in this, but I will most likely be reaching out to get some help with the, what sites would be especially interesting and promising. Because I think it's, what may look like the most interesting might not be necessarily the most promising. So I think we're probably going to need some help with that, but maybe not.
no, it is an interesting trade-off between like, which sites have, it's a sort of a combination of like the political interest, the groups that are available. Sometimes those don't necessarily always align with the sites that have, the most obvious, as I hear what you're saying about interesting versus promising.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to allow Chuck to talk. I think you have to unmute yourself first. Yeah.
My question is, do ponds fall into the use of this viewer and your efforts? And specifically, I'm looking at Baxter Pond, Mill Pond, Leeds Pond, Manhasset Valley Pond, all of which surround Manhasset Bay. Is this tool relevant to ponds, or is it only marshes?
I'd have to go, like do a map and look at geographically. The only time that freshwater ponds fall into the viewer is if they become inundated by salt water. So if they're close enough to the if they're close enough to the elevation's low enough and there's a hydraulic pathway for sea level rise to get there, then we do track that. And there is the potential for marsh growth in there, but this is focusing on this is focusing on coastal water incursion, and the SLAM model does look a little bit at the increase of the freshwater elevation. It's perched on, but we didn't do that. It's perched on the salt water, close to the water, but that's a particularly uncertain part of the model, and a little bit it's not as based. I don't believe was not brought into the NYSERDA project. So specific impacts on freshwater outside of those freshwater areas that would be inundated by salt water would not be captured.
So yeah, Jonathan, I can provide a little context. I think those areas that Chuck is referencing are probably would be tidally connected, if no infrastructure was placed between them and Manhasset Bay. And I know there was some interest I mentioned to you earlier about lower Manhasset Bay maybe being something of interest by other partners as well. So
Well, they do backflow, by the way. You say freshwater, they are flowing back and forth between Manhasset Bay. Manhasset Bay is flushing into Long Island Sound. So anyway, those are my areas. If those 4 ponds are my specific area, they call them ponds, but technically, in the case of Mill Pond, as an example, it definitely flows back and forth between Manhasset Bay, as does Manhasset Valley Park Pond.
So let me see if I can.
You don't have to spend a lot of time on it.
No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I just need to
Yep.
like, is this Kings Point right here? Yeah.
so
Here.
it's on the eastern side of Manhasset Bay, kind of up where it says Shore Road.
Yeah.
Yeah, right
I
there.
see. Yeah. Okay.
That's Mill Pond, that pond that's visible.
Right.
And then there's
Okay.
another pond
yeah.
that's just south of there.
Well,
Mill Pond has it has a bridge. The bridge has a tremendous opening underneath it, and the water on high tide flows into the pond, and then it flushes back out of the pond.
right,
That's
so-
not true of Baxter Pond, which is very close to that. Baxter Pond might be more of what you said. It's probably more of a freshwater. It's got, various different streams flowing into it, and it does nothing but flow out to Manhasset Bay.
Yeah, it gets this is one of the situations where it gets very tricky. The addition of tide gates and or tidal muting, in locations where there's a culvert, but there's still tidal behind, but the tide range is much lower. We do incorporate those to some degree, especially when we have data about them. If we had data, a lot of times we don't have data. We actually are just doing a big project in Connecticut right now where the state deployed a lot of water loggers on the other side of these. Even then the current condition, and the question is, okay, well, now what's your conceptual model if you add a meter of sea level rise onto that? And then also, most likely those culverts are going to be replaced in those circumstances with a different type of system, whether it's so there is more uncertainty when you get into these kind of situations.
Okay.
But what I can do for you though is I will look that up specifically. As you can see, we did not define. This is certainly in the model domain. We definitely have model results for it. I will look those up when we're offline, bring up the GIS results. I can, send you a map and get a sense myself of whether this is, I'm doubting that we had data. So it may not be that we have anything really too sophisticated for this area, but I'll look into it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have any thoughts about areas, or I guess or just even like sort of philosophical about what the best marsh conservation plan would look like? What is a plan that would get traction? Sarah, do you have any? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you had any thoughts or overviews about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in Nassau County, there are a few spots, as we've seen on the map, that, would have great potential for marsh conservation, but there are a lot of areas that, I think, as Heather was kind of referring to, it would be great if there was marsh conservation, but it might not be, as valuable as some of those other sites that have been prioritized through the mapping tool already. I think a lot of what people are interested in is having that shoreline protection and then those natural features that can, provide a buffer for storms and flooding, as we see those happening more and more in the future. So you know, I would think that a lot of the interest in this tool will be, or in the marsh conservation plans will be to provide, you know, community resilience and, you know, making that a priority in the conservation plans.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, certainly probably that will be a political driver of action. And then just, you know, to respond to your first thing you said, and I appreciate it. Just as a reminder, like, I don't think that we're afraid of like when Vicky and I went through these, we tried to identify the areas that were that had the most potential for marshes, or but we're not afraid of going in between to smaller areas if there's something that, you know, it's not we have the data, you know, as I was saying to Chuck, we definitely, for most, as long as they are coastal, you know, when you get inland and you get to, and I didn't know what exactly where geographically he was talking about until Sarah reminded me, but when you go a little bit, when you go inland past, you know, 4 or 5 meters of elevation, I think we cut off our modeling at 4 meters of elevation. The other thing is that this is because it's a Long Island a LIST project, a Long Island Sound Study project. It's, you know, we aren't going to be doing Southern Long Island or Connecticut.
Right.
But other than that, I think as long as it's in the list, sort of watershed area, you know, it's certainly in bounds.
Yeah, and I know that there were a few people that emailed me that said they couldn't attend and they would have liked to. So I'm hoping, you know, maybe after this meeting and you know, people take a little time to think about it, people will reach out with some more interest in working with us to do marsh conservation plan.
Sounds good. And you can
Yeah.
encourage them to, well, I'll send everybody the link, so you can send them the link as well. And you can encourage them to go to one of the other meetings if they would like
Yep.
to, because as we saw here, this was not strictly Nassau County professionals. It's a little bit, the presentation, you know, we were hoping, part of the reason that we were making them county specific is to try to get the people that might work together in one room. But that's not also a priority if they just want to get a sense of what's going on. So well, I think that's it. I unless anybody else has anything that they would like to add in terms of these questions, I appreciate the feedback that I did get very much. Actually, I will just say you guys are all priority left, but I have one more poll that I forgot to activate, which you might want to fill in really quickly, and it was just see if I can figure out how to do it. Let's see, polls. All right, launch the Marsh benefit survey. I meant to do this quite a bit earlier, but
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So it's which ecosystem services are most important to emphasize in a marsh conservation plan. And yeah. If Sarah, I appreciate you already gave some feedback on this question. And I do feel like you know, there's a smaller political will for ecology for the sake of ecology, and there's a larger political will for ecology for the sake of flood protection, wave attenuation, but however, I do feel like local character and culture is important. I mean, if you think about a community that is surrounded by marshes and you think about a community that is surrounded by vertical seawalls, you might get a different I'm not saying one's better or worse, but they have different character. So that can be an important piece as well. But I don't know if anybody, and the other, I guess, question is, did we miss something in terms of ecosystem services? We've spent a bit of time talking about this, so probably a lot of things fall into these general categories. Yeah, I have I'm not even going to really go into these, but there are some additional map types from the uncertainty analysis. We can look at, land to open water conversions, habitat change, which I think actually might be an important one. As I said, just because marsh contains both types of marshes. So here's just some example of those maps from Staten Island. We also, from the project with NYSERDA, we did some simple adaptation strategy simulations where we looked at cost versus benefits of land purchase, marsh restoration, thin layer deposition, and even restoration of developed lands, and compared those to baseline where you did nothing. I'm not, as I said, I'm not going to really go through this other than just to look at, we actually have a little bit of, again, going back into sort of an economic type of model, the benefits that you get for these adaptation strategies, given up model uncertainty versus the unit cost. One of the interesting findings was thin layer deposition doesn't necessarily buy you a lot of time, at least in terms of the way that we modeled it. But with that, I think I will thank you all very much for your time. I hope to be talking to interested groups in the future. If anybody couldn't make this, you can send them the recording or point them at one of next week's